Hello, this is Jim Schaefer, executive producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Randy Baier. Welcome to Rip Rap, Randy.
Thanks, glad to be here.
I've got this book here on the great modern poets, which is fascinating because it's what's underneath all this is not necessarily the discourse within the book, but what it took to put it together. And it's also fascinating because as a CD, which is kind of a modern publishing thing, of the poets reading their own work.
That's the value, great value to hear the
Right.
actual live poetry. So now tell me something about the difficulty of pulling this together. Are you talking simply about the choice of
which ones do you
which
select?
to put in? I suppose well, let me ask you this: was this designed as a sort of a thinking person's coffee table book, or is it something you would have in a class on poetry, a seminar on poetry?
Well, I think
how is it
designed? Functions several different ways. One is I think people might enjoy having it. It's wonderful to hear Dylan Thomas reading "Do Not Go Gently Into That Good Night." I think it's also a great teaching tool because there's an entire difference in listening to a poet read his or her work. I want to go back more, I want to have everyone, including students, struggling more to listen to the voices that are there. Not just the ones that have a stamp of approval, this is okay,
Yes,
this is good,
right.
whatever that is.
This is good.
But I want them to be listening to discern what is stuff that responds to them, that extends their awareness of their environment and their self and their family and their culture.
And so for to say, okay, this is writing also. This is shaping ideas in a totally different way than the way the word is used in Western culture or whatever. And then just the impossibility of language, just the difference, the sheer difference between saying something in French, saying something in Farsi, saying something in Javanese. You really have to understand the deeper textual meaning behind an utterance, a simple utterance.
There's such a value, though, to yourself personally and to your culture when they're at least an attempt to understand.
Right.
To extend your awareness from your own kind of clabbered up little self.
Right.
I'm not going to try, I'm going to justify American values.
Right.
No, that's not what's the issue. The issue is the discourse, the dialogue, the sharing of community.
Yeah.
And so I admired this book in the sense that, it had the CD with it, which they had. This is relatively new, and it takes a lot of work to get all
the
that
media
together.
that accompanies our publications now.
But I'm just saying
rich.
It takes a lot of work to put together that CD because you have to get releases and licenses and permissions to get that stuff and find stuff that's representative, and then to coordinate that all within the context of a book. But I still, as I looked at this, I was thinking, what other voices?
What could be more? Right.
Yeah.
What other things could be more? Well, perhaps they could have a series, but I think what you're hinting at is that you have kind of a on the page a blending of many different ideas and different cultural sort of expressions, so that they can sort of bounce off of each other.
I kept asking myself, who else should be in this? Who else should be here? I can think of many. My favorite poets, Wole Soyinka from Nigeria, and like I said before, Pablo Neruda. I mean, I would love to. Eduardo Galeano has a fantastic reading voice. So it's like, you probably know people in Indonesia or that area, and it opens up this thing, and I would rather have publishers not just take the convenient thing of, pandering to the canon, but to extend people's awareness.
Yeah. Well, there is a kind of poetic meter, not a kind. There are many serious poetic meters in various Indonesian cultures, but there is a form of a sort of collapsed, very rhythmical poetry called pantun, It's a very deep tradition, and there are a lot of soft vowels in some of the Indonesian languages. So there's a lot of the o and u and a and un use, and there's all this internal rhyming that goes on, and it's the same idea as the haiku. You have to collapse a small moment with a bigger idea, and it has something to do with something natural occurring. Moonlight, water running down a mountain, and so they'll have metaphors of love that have to do with water. And internally, there's all this rhyming within the sentences, and it's a strict structure. You get 4 lines, and you have to give this idea. And
well, as a reflecting, another issue with this is that the concept of book actually limits this. Because how much is going to take to produce it, who's going to be the people, who are the audience who's going to buy it.
Right.
And so in that sense, the whole thing about the book comes back, and we pay a penalty for that because it can only be of a certain size, certain cost,
Sure.
specific audience. And that's where the digital media may come in, and is coming in, where you can tap into video and other forms that could be longer and more arbitrary as far as length and context, and more inclusive in terms of the dimension.
Sure. Yeah.
And so
the book has its own serious limitations. There's no doubt about it.
Endless thing. It can't be ongoing.
Yeah.
And it has to include a specific finite number of participants.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's,
and it does represent a certain world. Those who can afford to buy it, for instance.
Yeah.
A certain subset of depending on the type of book. I mean, we're working with academic books. I suppose this would be a book for literati, maybe. I don't know if it's not. It doesn't pretend to be an academic book in the sense of.
Well, it's an academic book, but it certainly wouldn't appeal to the Sarah Palin average everyday American,
right,
because it requires a higher level of appreciation and an orientation toward poetry, which many people
well, this is one of the problems with being with education in some ways. Somehow in our society today, we've made education something to be well, this is a strain in American culture, the fear of intellectualism. And I work on my own bootstraps. I pulled myself up. I don't need book learning. There's that historical problem in our culture, as opposed to in some ways, some of what the founders of the country were espousing was like a well-educated. I mean, I know there were problems, with the Native Americans and with, this is a country that was born with slavery and this and that. But apart from that, the idea of an educated populace who makes decisions based on knowledge, that is really, even in our culture today, it's hard to maintain. It's a difficult road.
Well, not only is education now crucial for people to succeed if they're going to make real substantive money, but the other thing is that we're in a global knowledge economy.
Good point. Yep.
And so, besides the fact, I think that all of us people ought to be thinking and reflecting and not just reacting to events. And then that's the way that we can have a more satisfying interaction, a richer involvement with each other.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not necessarily, Joe American who's at the bar drinking beers with a T-shirt on, But still, that's my hope, is that. So, in a way, this is both a victory, but it's also somewhat less than that, because it's a victory so that people can hear them.
Yeah.
And you can see the poems and reflect on them. But then there's that other thing about who else would have been richer to include.
Yeah. The great modern poets in their own words. We're done with that. What's next?
And that was edited by Michael Schmidt. Next is Proust in the Squid, The Story and Science of the Reading Brain by Marianne Wolfe, who is a professor of child development at Tufts University, where she's also director of the Center for Reading and Language Research. And what's interesting is that, and it starts right out saying, she argues, as others, that we were not meant to read as human beings.
Now that's intriguing.
We weren't.
We were meant to hear and listen and talk.
We were never born to read. Human beings invented reading only a few thousand years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And with this invention, we rearranged the very organization of our brain, which in turn expanded the ways we're able to think, which altered the intellectual evolution of our species.
Well, were we meant to cook? I mean, this is intriguing because somebody discovered fire and somebody discovered the wheel. Were we meant to cook?
I think it's an issue of evolution. But the point she's making is that those now who have trouble reading, it helps to understand that it's an adaptation process that needs to happen.
Yeah.
And the other thing that helps is the plasticity that's at the heart of the brain's design forms the basis for much of who we are and who we might become. And that's the relevance to the squid, because the squid was not intended to swim.
That's it.
If you look at a squid, you really
wonder how
does
it do that? Well, the other thing that I'm from my brief 3-minute awareness of this book now that I'm thinking of, it seems to be some ramifications here. People struggle with reading. I mean, some humans, me for instance, are not such great readers, or that reading is almost like an alien form of knowledge gathering. I mean, certainly I read and I enjoy it. I especially like reading poetry, for instance, but I think I'm more of an oral myself. I think I'm a more oral, visual, interactive learner than I am a reader. And I have some colleagues who are very deep readers and need to be sequestered. They need quiet and they need to be sequestered away, to take time when they are reading. And I've always had I'm just interpreting this, my solipsistic way, but I've always had a different relationship to reading. So maybe there's some truth to her point about the alienness of reading.
Well, what she's contrasting Proust is she said that Proust saw reading as a kind of intellectual sanctuary, similar to what you were saying, where human beings have access to thousands of different realities they might never encounter or understand otherwise. Each of these new realities is capable of transforming readers' intellectual lives without ever requiring them to leave the comfort of their armchairs. So by reading, you participate in all these other realities.
Well, the other reality, sure, the imagination, that's the glory of reading. That's
and the whole thing of conjuring up your own long-stored memories of books, the secret places you have found to read away from the intrusions of siblings and friends, the thrilling sensations elicited by people like Jane Austen, Charlotte Bronte, Mark Twain. And he said even the muffled beam of the flashlight you hoped your parent wouldn't notice beneath the sheets.
Sure, right.
But then the squid also represents a complementary way of understanding different dimensions in the reading process because it has its own way of adapting. And her real thing she's trying to get to is the whole thing of people who have some kind of difficulty in doing that.
Right.
And trying to understand the array of mental or cognitive processes, the attention, memory, and visual, auditory, and linguistic process, what is involved with reading and understanding. And one of the things I saw her give a presentation on this book is that people who do well with reading, they pause. They read and then they pause and reflect. People who have reading issues don't do that.
Just keep on going.
Well, because they're trying to get it done,
right?
And so they power ahead. They're not. And so, what she says the thing to do is to work with people who are trying to gain some competence on encouraging them to take a pause for a minute and reflect and make it a more interactive process. And she says this is also a biological thing about how information shifts from one part of the brain to the other.
Well, I imagine, I don't know, I'm not a psychologist, but I imagine it must be, I guess I'm thinking of a sort of mechanical way here. Recall and how you store things, how you learn. There's immediate, you take things in immediately, but you somehow must have to package them back there so that you can pull out store them and then pull it out when you need it to understand something new. And so there's that, I mean, it's almost like a sort of computer storage kind of metaphor, I suppose, in some way.
Well, she talks about this cognitive scientist, David Swinney, who says that every word read activates many possible meanings.
Yeah,
that's where the pause comes in.
That's interesting.
Is to do just what you're saying, is to store them somewhere, and that's where it shifts across the brain so that you're putting it in there. And then it gets into the people with reading problems, it's a decoding process. So they need to look at that.
You know, that's interesting. Even on a micro level, the meaning of words, the individual meanings of words, and then, of course, there's a word itself, and that has sort of various meanings that are sort of hard-coded meanings. But then there's the word as it lives in a sentence or in a paragraph, and it takes on a whole different shift. And if you don't know those implications, the prior textual, placement of that word, and I'm not talking just, house or...
No, that's exactly
it. But that is really hard for people who are trying to understand this.
Well, she talks about this clinician and linguist, Rebecca Kennedy, says just that. The vocabulary is one aspect of oral language that comes for free in learning to read. That, that's how you learn these different meanings as you're reading it. You're looking at it in context. And so that's just exactly what you said is just exactly true, that our ability to use context is fostered by reading itself. Mm-hmm. So I thought this was interesting that she has a diagram here showing reading brain at the earliest stages, and then this need to, but they found that in working with people with dyslexia, by encouraging them to reflect on and allow them to store, was an enormous breakthrough.
Right.
They just,
rather than struggling with the
just plowing
the D's and the B's and the P's and the Q's.
Specifically, she said the fluent comprehending brain moves information between the dorsal route and the ventral route. In other words, in the brain, they're actually going different places, and it's a process for retrieval.
So I guess reading difficulties have something, physically have something to do with that linking
up.
It's
a wiring issue. That's what I tell my students who have learning challenges. And the research has shown that students with learning challenges have above average intelligence and above average motivation, but it's a wiring thing. And so I was fascinated with this, that part of the wiring thing literally is that of how you store information in the brain itself so that you can retrieve it. And they have a phonological map. And it even has it down to the milliseconds in terms of as you're reading. But she said the most important thing is pausing for a minute as you're going along.
That's interesting.
I'm
going to try that technique.
If you know that what's important is not only the reading, but the storing the information, and allowing yourself to do that,
giving yourself some,
then it could change the whole task.
Well, the beauty of language and words and sentences and paragraphs is that every one is a whole different, incredible new shape, a new idea. You pick up a book, whether it be great literature or you pick up any kind of document, and there's a new way of expressing an idea. We just don't possibly write the same way. And this week my neighbor brought out, I was over just stopping by, and I saw these old valentines on her, these very ornate, old, flowery valentines. And I said, when were these made? She says, now I have to tell you the story. These are my grandmother's valentines, and we tried to figure out, they're all around the 1900, 1910, a whole different era of language, and they were in this very florid
cursive.
a kind of cursive printing, exactly.
Well, they could do an A that had all the circles
yes,
on it.
and the ideas with them, the way they expressed, they'd use words like bedight, and a ray of light that is the heart. I'm sending my ray of light to you. But these florid Victorian or whatever Edwardian, idea, or American, of course, but ideas. But I looked at them and I went, I really need to understand how to decode. I mean, it's obviously I am sending my heart to you through this ray of light. That's an obvious image, but it's a whole other, very innocent and this ornate subtext going on of messaging that we don't do that anymore. We just don't.
Well, it's a rhetorical device of euphemisms, so that something that's intensely felt, you don't do it in the first blush. What you're doing is couching it in a way to come in as a secondary information, but not directly. It's all indirect reference.
That's true. Right. Now, I was I was comparing it to I said, did you see the cover of the New Yorker a year ago for Valentine's Day? It was this passionate embrace of a man and a woman on the cover of the New Yorker, and little Cupid is in the background. He, I just sent my arrow. But the arrow is going completely through their midsection, like basically right through their groin, from the guy through the woman. And the two of them are like in its back. This is the cover of the New Yorker for Valentine's Day. And I said, my God, you're talking 100 years. I mean, this might look like so innocent and, subtle and euphemistic, as you say, it's all in the back. But this is like so hysterically blatant. And, on one hand you go, well, I don't have to decode that message. But in a certain way you do. You still have that. Of course, that was an issue devoted to Valentine's Day, so within the New Yorker were all these different, Valentine's stories.
But that's all those associated memories with language.
Yeah.
One of the things that I find always useful with my students, and she points out, is who's been dyslexic. Mm-hmm. People like Thomas Edison, Leonardo da Vinci, and Albert Einstein, and they each had reasons why. For example, Thomas Edison, in his childhood, had difficulties with reading, but he also had an enormous amount of ill health, and so he couldn't attend formal school. Mm-hmm. Leonardo da Vinci was one of the most creative people, but he was considered dyslexic based on his bizarre voluminous notes, which are written from right to left in reverse-looking script, full of misspellings, syntactical mistakes, and strange errors in language.
Unreal. It's not just intentional in a mirror. It's like not only once you get that deciphered, issue, right? Yeah, right. And yet look at what he painted.
And Albert Einstein did not speak much until 3 years old. Mm-hmm. Was mediocre at any subject required the retrieval of words, such as foreign language. He once said, "My principal weakness was a bad memory, especially a bad memory for words and texts." He went so far to say that the words did not seem to play any role in his theoretical thinking, which came to him through more or less clear images. Now, there's other research I'm aware of that people read really fast. Don't read literally; they read in a photo way.
Yeah, when I was a freshman in college, my parents sent me to a reading seminar because I had always had trouble reading, and my dad said, "Oh yeah, you got to do this." So I did that for 6 weeks, and that was the principle at the time, of getting a photo image, reading relatively quickly, and capturing the idea as a whole. And I had trouble doing it that way too. I mean, I struggle with reading. Actually.
I read in this photo way, so I look at the visual. Because if you sit down in a chair with your favorite book and a cup of coffee or whatever your favorite beverage is, and go by page, that's too slow for me. But they said that if you use this photo image visualization, you can read 100 times faster.
Yeah.
And so I thought that was interesting.
And get the comprehension, which is that's the essence
so
of it.
fast that what you're looking for is the meta discourse. So I found this book really fascinating, and the conclusion is that whole thing that about, they said every society worries over the future of its young and the challenges they face. No one describes the accelerating pace of those challenges at this moment in human evolution. And there's some people like Ray Kurzweil who has done work on depicting the staggering shifts that may occur as 100 trillion neural connections in our brains extend exponentially through the technological, non-biological intelligence we have invented. In other words, how we approach reading had perhaps compounded the task enormously. So it increases the difficulty level. And then, and I think it's also liberating for people who suffer from dyslexia to see that there are ways of doing it, and deal with it. You have another one there on gliding for gold.
Well, this is fascinating. I looked at this briefly, and I've always thought this is gliding for gold, the physics of winter sports. So luge, bowling, or curling, skiing, of course, ice skating. I mean, the thing that I've always been fascinated by, just as a mental image, is that ice skates are riding on a small bubble of water, and that is where the glide comes from. It's almost like when you hear people talk about magnetic or anti-magnetic trains, electronic trains that ride on a magnet, so that the magnets are actually polarized to repel, so that they go very fast because of the magnetic power. It's almost like there's some little bit of water underneath, which of course makes things. But this book reveals the actual physics of it.
Well, there's something fascinating in there
that
just really caught my attention. One is, like in hockey and figure skating, that's not one piece of ice. They have to put it down in layers. Because if it was one piece of ice, it would crack. So it's layers of 3/4 of an inch each.
That makes a lot of sense.
And so they keep laying down these layers of ice,
which will
and then for a hockey game they do the painting for the logo and all that stuff, and then lay down
another layer of ice.
But it also has to be very temperature specific. Well, we did another riprap, believe it or not.
We did. This was fascinating. We had 20 books and got through 4.
Yeah.
That's about typical for us.
Well, thank you for being a riprap.
You're welcome. I'm glad to be here, and we're continuing the program. So, great. Thanks for having me, Jim.